Wilson, and I represent one of the two seats in Chittenden 14, which is part of Burlington. And I am here today to talk to you about H4, which is a bill that I've actually introduced in different forms twice before, and did not introduce it last biennium, partially because egg prices were so high and I didn't want to do that. And I've had constituents ask me about the issue again and want to talk to you about why reforming our egg laws is important. So I know that Ledge Council will walk you through what this bill does, but let me tell you what problems this bill is addressing. So there are three basic issues, and I'm hoping if the committee is excited to take on this bill, that you will add some language to further enhance one of the three, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So the three issues are animal cruelty, health, and consumer protection. So let me talk about animal cruelty first. More and more states are instituting farm animal confinement bans. Many chickens still live their lives in a space less than the area the size of paper. So the United Egg Producers minimum standards are considered extremely minimum. They require chickens to have 67 square inches, a dimension smaller than a piece of notebook paper. And even so, there's estimates that a large percentage of hens are still not even meeting those minimum standards. I'm also happy to share with you and can send your committee assistant the research that I did, because I've done some more recent research when I reintroduced the bill. So it'll give you the backup for a lot of what I'm talking about. So laying hens are often born in commercial hatcheries, and they're hatched by the thousands in industrial incubators. Basically, chickens or laying hens are beak trimmed often. They end up, and they do that to decrease cannibalism and aggressive tendencies because they're squished together. The hens have very short lives, usually less than 2 years, and again, are confined most of the time. So the horrors of sort of what happens to these hens has been important to many of the constituents that I've heard from. And one thing that I heard from a few people was, look, it's really important to us to buy eggs that the hens were treated well. And we're really confused by the label. And like, what does that mean? You know, what does cage-free mean, or free range, or free roaming, or pasture raised, or certified organic, farm fresh? There's a great Consumer Reports article I'll share with you that goes through that. Because people don't want to be paying extra for something that isn't delivering what they thought. So my bill does not get at the labeling, and that's the part that should you want to add that, so that people would know what they're getting, that would be very helpful. So the health of people consuming the eggs. Battery cages account for nearly 90% of the American egg supply, but they've also been linked to higher salmonella rates than the use of larger colony cages that are sort of more free range or cage-free hens are in. The European Food Safety Authority found that salmonella is 5 times more likely to be present in cage systems compared to free range systems. The reason for the decreased risk with cage-free systems is most likely the combination of cage-free systems being cleaner, having fewer rodents, the systems themselves being easier to clean and disinfect. The hens have more of a natural gut flora. They're less stressed, making them less susceptible to illness. The eggs from these chickens also have lower levels of chemical residue from insecticides and lower concentrations of dioxin-like contaminants. Currently, roughly 8% of the nationwide egg supply is affected by the latest avian flu outbreak. Large corporations selectively breed animals to share traits to maximize profitability. Given that many factory farmed animals share genetic material, one sick animal can easily infect the rest. One question I've been asked, and I've been looking at best I can from the research out there, is do cage-free egg laws contribute to avian flu outbreaks? So there's an article from KGW, which is a TV radio station. No cage-free egg laws aren't contributing to avian flu outbreaks. Outdoor chicken flocks are at greater risk of bird flu, but cage-free laws do not require chickens to be outdoors, and most cage-free flocks stay inside. Most commercial cage-free operations keep their flocks in controlled indoor environments. So, consumer protection and demand. We definitely, as I mentioned, need help with assuring the integrity of agricultural product labeling. I have a survey from the ASPCA from 2016. There's been a more recent survey, which I have a copy of. I did not fully get through it, but I'm happy to share it with the committee. But in 2016, approximately 3/4 of consumers surveyed were concerned about the welfare of animals raised for food and are paying more attention than they were 5 years ago to food labels. The survey showed that consumers are confused about how animal welfare is monitored. They're concerned about oversight on a lot of farms. Nationally, many grocery chains and companies are converting to cage-free eggs due to increasing awareness and public demand for high welfare standards. In 2014, again, there were more recent ones, nearly 2/3 of Americans routinely wanted to spend more to buy specialty eggs because they didn't want to buy eggs from animals that were mistreated. 50% were looking for a free-range label, 48% were looking for a cage-free label, and 47% were looking for an organic label. However, nobody could describe what these terms meant. So the ballot measures, the first state to do a egg law, and I know Mike is going to go through this in greater detail, was California. Their ballot measure won by a wide margin, 64% of the vote. A few years ago, Massachusetts had a ballot measure that passed with 78% of the vote. I want to just talk for a moment about the cost of eggs, because that is something that is concerning to me as the sponsor of the bill. So the egg industry has been rapidly transitioning over the past few years as more states have enacted cage-free laws. There are now 10 states that have passed these laws. Cage-free operations are generally considered a bit more expensive to run and result in higher egg prices at the grocery store. However, there's a consensus among experts that the biggest driver of major egg price spikes in recent years is not the cage-free transition, it's bird flu. So from November 24 to December 24, egg prices rose 14%. Egg prices are up 60% in the last 12 months and 160% since 2019. Partially, I learned the USDA offers or offered compensation for birds culled to contain an outbreak, but not for birds killed by the virus. So there's a deliberate incentive for farmers to quickly cull an entire flock when cases start popping up. And even a handful of bird flu cases can have an outsized impact on the egg-laying population, leading to abrupt egg supply shortages and price spikes. And what's interesting is 75% of the US egg-laying hens in the US are raised on just 347 factory farms, with an average of approximately 850,000 animals on those farms crammed together in tight quarters. Last week, Roseacre Farms, the second largest egg producer in the US, confirmed avian flu at their facility. When our food supply is so concentrated into just some massive farms, it has a significant impact on the supply chain. The 5 largest shell egg producing states are home to approximately 44% of all laying eggs in the US. Vermont is not in the top 5 or the top 10. I do have data I can pass around on what the economic impact is of egg production in Vermont. Cage-free hens are continuing to make up an increasing portion of the total US egg-laying flock. In March 2024, the cage-free flock was reported at about 40%, or 124.8 million layers of the US flock. However, due to the avian flu, the US Department of Agriculture estimated that 136.3 million hens, nearly 8% of the US's egg-laying hens, died or were killed off due to the virus. The current avian flu outbreak started in 2002. And nationally, so far, have been found on 643 commercial farms. Outbreaks on a handful of farms can set off huge price increases. Even if farms are not affected, egg producers have raised their prices. So I'm also asked, is this a problem in Vermont? I'm not sure if it's a problem in Vermont. I can tell you that the largest egg producer in the country, Cal-Maine, for example, has been buying up smaller farms. That's one of the ways that it's become one of the largest producers. And I don't know if Vermont is susceptible to getting purchased by one of the biggest egg producers. And it seems important as a preventive measure to look at having these laws on the books. We now have 10 states that are doing them. I'm not sure how much this will be monitored on the national level. There's been comments made about stop announcing avian flu outbreaks to people. And I think it's time for Vermont to make sure that we're doing what's important to us to protect both the people that are eating the eggs, to not be being horribly abusive to the animals that we're using, and to give consumers a sense of what they're getting. So that's why I introduced this bill again with Representative Paul, and hope that you'll consider taking up. There's so much really interesting research, and I am thrilled to, as I said, pass it on to you and share the little bit that I've learned in my spare time.
Great. Thank you very much. Before you turn the seat over to Michael Grady, does anybody have any questions for Representative Richardson? I think it was a very helpful overview. All right, then why don't we ask Mike to come up and Mike, if you want to put the bill up on the screen.
Can you send me the Zoom link? I've been having problems with my iPad and I can't get to my email.
Okay.
Is that what it is?
That's like heaven. Our phone doesn't work. Yeah, our phone works.
It's maybe the slightest red light on,
What?
checking a light on.
Where'd the iPad thing go? There. You're not doing a very good job, Rapco, probably. Monitoring that
That
thing.
was that's nice job.
you up right now.
We do have this on our webpage too, if anybody wants to look at it while Mike's pulling it up.
Maybe on, yeah.
The big cheese with Kevin.
Okay.
Right.
This is Michael Grady with Legislative Council. As you or some of the returning members might recall, last year you amended the egg law in Vermont for the first time in almost 35 years to help modernize it and to adopt some additional standards for the fair sale and raising of eggs in the state. This bill would add to those standards by requiring certain space requirements for the raising of hens in order for the eggs from those hens to be sold in the state. It is based on a California law. As Representative Rachelson noted, there was Prop 12 in California. So many states have what are called basically constitutional proposition authority, where just a certain number of citizens can sign a petition to get a question added to an election ballot each year or every 6 months. That was what happened in California. It was a requirement or a question as to whether or not animals needed to be humanely raised and provided with adequate space. In doing so, as Representative Rachelson noted, the proposition passed fairly overwhelmingly. But what that left was the question of what does it mean for each type of animal to be raised humanely with adequate space. California went through a process and adopted standards for each type of animal: cows, dairy cows, pork, hens, etc. Almost all of those standards were litigated at one point, and almost all of them were upheld. The most recent was the National Pork case, the beginning or April of last year, I believe, or maybe the year before. The argument was that these laws impose requirements that extend beyond the boundaries of the state, because the law says you, in order to sell eggs in the state, you need to meet certain standards. And as you might imagine, pork producers from Iowa, North Carolina, et cetera, were not happy with the standards for raising pork underneath the new Prop 12 statute. And I'll tell you, I did like a little training on the National Pork case. I mapped out how big a space the pigs were getting. It was bigger than my first apartment in DC. Because if you had a couple of pigs together, they had to get extra space. The U.S. Supreme Court said that was not what's called extraterritorially unconstitutional. There was an argument that whenever a state law applies outside the state boundaries, it's extraterritorial and per se unconstitutional under the Dormant Commerce Clause. The U.S. Supreme Court said, no, that's not the case. What you need to do is you have to look at each individual law and see if it discriminates against commerce. And the court said that the law didn't discriminate against commerce, that it applied the law equally to in-state interest versus out-of-state interest. If you are out of state or in-state, you needed to meet those same space standards for the purpose of selling the eggs in the state. And that's actually a pretty long held kind of U.S. Supreme Court precedent. It extends from this case in Minnesota, where Minnesota said if you're going to sell milk in the state, you have to sell milk in a certain size container. And it was probably intentionally targeted at Wisconsin, because the Wisconsin farmers automatically litigated. And the court said, no, I mean, it applies to Minnesota farmers as much as it does to Wisconsin farmers. Wisconsin farmers don't want to have that kind of container, then they don't need to sell it into Minnesota. And that's effectively what the court in the National Pork case said, and will be the situation here. If you don't meet the standards, you don't need to sell it into the state. It doesn't mean it's not constitutional. So that's kind of the framework of where this bill is coming from. As Representative Rachelson has said, she's introduced a similar bill in previous years. And I've always been a little bit like, oh, this has got extraterritorial effect. I was a little concerned about that. But I'm not concerned about that anymore because of the national port case.
Representative Burt.
We had with sugaring equipment, we've had to go through a similar thing the last, it was probably about 10 years ago at least, that none of our fittings contain lead-based brass.
Right,
And that was because of a law passed.
right,
Because
because,
now our packaging company, which is Butter Mountain Farm, Emma was here. They asked all the producers, sorry, you need to change overall your fittings, which is
Right.
was not cheap.
no, but you could have said, we don't want to sell them to California, but then you would have lost like one of the most major markets in the country, right?
Yeah.
Representative Thompson.
Yeah, so I'm wondering in terms of, I mean, the language of the bill seems a little bit vague. So I mean, is it applying basically to like, if you're raising eggs to sell in Vermont or beyond, you have to have the chickens have a certain kind of space
Sure.
requirement? That would be in this bill as it is.
Yeah, why don't we walk through the text
Okay.
of the bill as it
Okay.
is? As I said earlier, it's adding to that chapter on eggs in Title VI, which you amended just last year. It's adding a definition of egg laying hen, which is any female poultry kept for the purpose of egg production. Poultry is the definition that the agency looked for last year. Remember how they were trying to have a uniform definition of poultry across all their various chapters, and that's what it is, all domesticated birds of all ages that produce eggs that are edible as human food. And then you come down to, you can actually go quite a bit down. There's a new section that's being added related to unlawful confinement.
Can I, Mike, sorry, for a refresher for returning members and for newer members, text that's underlined is proposed new text
Yes.
to statute. And then anything that's not underlined or not crossed out, it already is in statute.
So I just want to kind of clarify Representative Boslin's question. This chapter is how you meet the requirements to sell eggs in the state. So one of the things that you have to do is you have to raise your eggs, raise your hens in compliance with this new section 352A related to unlawful confinement. So it says a person shall not confine an egg laying hen in a space that prevents the hen from fully spreading both wings without touching the side of an enclosure or other egg laying hens. They shall have access to the amount of usable floor space per hen that complies with the guidelines and for cage free, which is readily available online. It's only 25 pages long. The floor space requirement for a multi-tiered hen barn is 1 square. Yep, it's 1 square foot of usable floor space. And if you don't have a multi-tiered barn, then it's 1.5 square feet of usable floor space per hen. And the requirements don't apply to medical research, temporary confinement for examination, testing, etc. It doesn't apply to an ag fair. It doesn't apply during temporary confinement for animal husbandry, for breeding. It doesn't apply to the humane slaughter as long as you are complying with the humane slaughter laws. It is in addition to and not in lieu of any other laws protecting animal welfare in the state. So the animal cruelty laws would apply. The slaughter laws would apply. So they continue to apply. And it's not an affirmative defense that the egg-laying hen was raised, managed, and used by a farm in accordance with livestock husbandry practices. That subdivision is there because under the animal cruelty laws, it provides that any practice that is an accepted livestock husbandry practice cannot be animal cruelty. And that's important because when you come down to page 5, line 12, you will see that a violation of this law can be enforced as animal cruelty. Animal cruelty generally is a criminal violation, but there are provisions of it, 13 VSA 353A4B, which are civil citations, so it's just a fine. So these would begin with your first offense as a civil citation and then move to 13 VSA 353A. That should probably say 353A4 capital A. And that would be a criminal offense for a second or subsequent offense. So if it's a regular animal cruelty civil citation, it's up to $500. If it's a regular, I'll tell you why I'm saying regular. If it's a regular criminal animal cruelty, it's 1 year in jail and up to $2,000 fine, up to 1 year in jail and up to $2,000 fine. I say regular because there's something called aggravated animal cruelty where the penalties are strictly criminal and the time in jail is up to 5 years, and I think the fine is up to $15,000. So, but you have to meet certain specific criteria for aggravated animal cruelty. All right, so one of the things that you'll probably ask is, well, how is the Secretary of Agriculture going to enforce this? Well, first, there's specific enforcement authority in the egg law, and it follows the general model that the agency uses for enforcement. They send you a letter and tell you what your alleged violation is. They give you an opportunity to cure. If you don't cure, you're told, if you don't take the corrective action, you're told what the penalty will be. And so we just walked through what the penalties could be under but there's also a penalty underneath this chapter for violation, and there's also a penalty underneath the agency's General Administrative Enforcement Authority in Title VI, Chapter 1.
Right?
Mike, at what point, if you were a farm, do you cross the line into not good standing, say, with our agency of ag, if you had a violation?
Generally, you have been subject to a corrective action letter. You failed to implement the corrective action. You failed at that point to respond to the agency. They will contact you, especially for one of these programs, a couple of times to try to get you to comply. And they might give you a schedule of compliance, which is a time, because sometimes you can't comply because of time of year, et cetera, practices that can be done. And so they may give you a schedule of compliance. If you continue to not comply, you have an action filed against you that it's ongoing, or you have failed to pay the fine or do whatever the equitable remedy is, then they will find you not in good standing. There aren't a lot of farms that get there. You're given a lot of opportunity to do it. Sometimes the farm is just going to be stubborn, I guess, and not comply because sometimes they don't think they need to comply. But you can also not comply all the way right up to the court steps, and the agency will accept a settlement or literally right before an enforcement proceeding. And they've done that. So animal cruelty offenses are brought by what are called humane officers, which last year you defined to basically mean law enforcement or someone hired as an animal welfare officer by law enforcement. So that's who's bringing the animal cruelty violations. The agency can also enforce this chapter. The agency has its own enforcement authority. It can bring it however it likes, either under this chapter or under its general administrative enforcement authority. I don't really need to read through the verbal order or the written order or the cease and desist. That's kind of the process that they use in this chapter. And then you come to the animal cruelty law in section 2, lines 12 through 14. You'll see that an exception from the scope of the animal cruelty chapter is livestock and poultry husbandry practices for raising, management, and use of animals. This would accept that. So it remains an exception provided that the requirements of the ag law shall be enforceable under the animal cruelty subchapter. Then you get to the penalties that we talked about for animal cruelty in section 3. Scrolling down, line 17, a person found in violation of the confinement standards for egg-laying hens may be imprisoned not more than 2 years or fined not more than 5,000 or both for a second or subsequent violation. So the first violation is going to be, as we talked about previously, is going to be under sub B. It's going to be that civil citation, which you can see on page 10, is going to be a civil penalty of not more than $500. $500 are the caps. If you go to a court and you admit that you were in violation, they will give you what's called the default penalty. Default penalty is much less than the maximum. If you go to court and you object and you wait for a final order from the court, they're more likely to give you closer to the maximum, but it's not always the maximum penalty. And that's pretty much the bill. It would take effect July 1, 2026. So there'd be effectively a little more than a year, depending on when you enact this, for farms to come into compliance. I was watching the news this morning. I saw a Vermont farm, multi-tiered barn. So that meant they only would need to provide a foot of space, usable floor space. They probably could have met it pretty quickly just by managing the number of hens in that barn.
Which might mean reducing the number of hens and
Or building another barn.
Representative Nelson.
Yes. Does it have the definition of what a chicken farm is? Egg laying farm, is it a backyard flock of 10 hens or 20 hens, or is it gotta be more commercial in nature? Is it anyone selling eggs to the neighbors?
So this is not restricted to the scale of the pardon?
It looks like that number 4, person means any individual, right?
Right. So the confinement standard is not limited to the commercial farm. You could easily do that. You could easily say that a person subject to the RAPs, and that then means that they are a commercial farm, had to meet this standard. But right now, as it's drafted, it's any person.
Okay, and this is just the farms in Vermont? Or is this applying to, we can't get it, if, and I'm sure Drews do it right, but if Drews were more of the,
If they were in a cage, if they didn't have the space.
would their eggs be able to be sold in Vermont?
Yeah.
Or crashed on, Pete and Jerry's there crashed on the side of the road.
So if they would be in violation, they'd be unlawfully confining their hens. Now, you can be a little bit more specific about the prohibition. You could say that no person shall sell an egg in the state if it does not comply with this section.
But this is just for instance.
Well, no, this is the way that you could be clear. Let me just say, you could be clear about that. and that's my fault. I could have been clearer.
Okay, and then we don't have registration of backyard flocks in this state, just the farms that require that need the RAPs.
Yes, it's just the farms that meet the RAPs, but the standard for chickens is, I think, it's 50, I think. And I can double check that for you.
It's what, the commercial?
That to make you subject to the RAPs, to make you a regulated farm. I'm pretty sure it's the Noah's Ark list for what makes you subject. And I think it's 50. It might even be a little less.
By the way, I bought a dozen free range eggs Sunday locally for $4.50 a dozen.
And
Should beat it with a stick.
somebody came in and testified last week that they would give away their eggs because they had so many, right? Yeah,
Right.
it's a strange
Good
market.
thing we got small farm in our
Yeah.
state.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's 50 turkeys, it's 50 geese, and it's 100 laying hens. So that makes you a regulated farm.
Very long, but poop volume. Thank you.
Representative O'Brien.
Like on the penalties, it's 500, what, once you're cited?
For your first offense. For your first offense.
Okay,
And that's if they're going after you under animal cruelty. If the agency decides to enforce under its administrative, general administrative penalty authorities, it's a maximum of $5,000.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you, Jim. Can we make this money, because it's agriculture, go to the Department of Agriculture instead of the general fund?
So generally enforcement, the fines, penalties, et cetera, by law go into the general fund to discourage agencies from over enforcing to support their budget.
Good clarification. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So there's a distinction between a bill that might say we're going to prohibit a practice on our farms in Vermont, and a bill that might say we're going to prohibit the sale of the product, eggs, that come from a farm anywhere that follows or doesn't follow a practice.
But I should have listened to Representative Rachel when I was doing this, but you could be more clear in that this chapter applies to how you sell eggs in the state. And it says that eggs need to be raised or hens need to be raised in a certain way. I could be clearer, and if you wanted to be clearly applying to eggs that are imported, like pork is imported into California, you can do that.
So that would be a choice of the committee. Yeah, Representative.
along those lines, how does California then enforce those pork rules? Do they send enforcement people out to Iowa?
You're right. They call it a certificate of compliance. So the purchaser asks for a certificate of compliance. Supplier provides.
I wouldn't expect you to know the answer to this necessarily, Mike, but there are in California or other states, and I think we have in at least one neighboring state that has adopted a law similar to California. So it would be interesting to know whether the price of eggs in Hannaford, for example, is any different than it is in other states where they don't have that, in Vermont, for example.
I can check. There are consumer price indexes that would indicate what an average dozen eggs would cost in each state.
And
I know from looking at Colorado and Michigan, which their laws just went to effect. It's been very hard because the avian flu has been, you know, corresponded with that. So again, I've heard from people too, where they're saying that the cage-free eggs that they're buying are not really more expensive. I could not believe what eggs were doing at the grocery store, but it may just be so many hens were killed recently and we're just seeing that. Massachusetts has had it now for a few years. Rhode Island also has a law. I'm trying to think of other East Coast ones. It's more.
Ohio.
So if it has a regional bearing, I guess I'd say that makes it a little easier. One thing in my mind, sorry, I didn't.
Go ahead, yeah.
If our stores really struggle to compete with Hampshire because of tax problems already, right? So, and if eggs are $1 a dozen cheaper, you know, it's one more incentive for people to cross the state line into New Hampshire. But if Massachusetts is on board and if New Hampshire got on board, that would be really helpful.
New York right now is looking at such a bill. So there's legislation that was introduced. So.
Yeah, looking at in the supermarket a week ago. I did see a lot of variation in all the different labels on the eggs, cage-free, free range, pasture raised. You know, lived in my own 8x10 room egg. They're all kind of similar, within 50 cents a dozen. Bit more pricing on color and size. Was the difference in the prices, so yeah. I gotta wrap my head around it. I'd like to know what Giroux do over in New York, because they're probably our largest supplier of eggs. How do they raise their eggs over in New York? And they are really an upscale operation in everything they do, so I can find out.
They in Champlain,
They're just the other side.
Blacksburg or Champlain.
And, you know, the price of eggs has all got to do with diesel fuel and the price of corn and soybean and whatnot, and then the H1, you know, H5N1. That's the big one right now.
All right, thank you very much, both of you, and I will excuse Mike as Representative Rachel Flynn.
Thank you.
Thank you. And if you'd like, let me know. I'll get you my research.
Great, thank you.
Mike.
Before we wrap things up today, I just wanted to see whether anyone had any questions or thoughts that you wanted to raise in any of the testimony we had today, or that we've had any other day, I suppose. Yeah, we are not off the air. We're having a discussion. So. Representative Ryan.
Just for your constituent and you, will this be a bill on PSNP succession?
Will I be drafting a bill?
Right, like this was the first where we had a
Right,
advocate
no,
come in without a bill, really sort of
right.
talking about it as if it was a bill.
I think I need to connect with Senator Clarkson, who was
Okay.
making commentary about perhaps engaging in a bill on the Senate side. And if that's not the case, then perhaps there's an avenue here.
Yeah, so I think that if the committee were interested in that, particular topic, we could think about putting it into a committee bill or amending another bill that might come along, if in fact the Senate isn't working on something.
So what did Sue ask for?
She asked who was co-sponsoring it, but it hasn't been introduced yet.
So
So we were confused if somebody had introduced, I mean, maybe somebody has introduced it, but we didn't know about it and she didn't know about it. So we're not sure.
So the program's currently is at AHS. So the way it would be drafted, if you're gonna amend that statute, the clerk's probably gonna send it to Human Services. So that might dictate how you want to make the change. You might want to wait for one of the miscellaneous ag bills and put it in a miscellaneous ag bill.
Or maybe somebody's drafting a bill that is gonna show up on the floor and in a week. I guess we don't know that either.
And I was unclear, if there's no bill, what happens? The program just goes away? Is the contract runs out? Is
I
that?
think the program continues on as it's running. They're asking to just encourage people to pay more money, I believe, at registration.
Yeah, whatever it is that she highlighted where she was looking to have some changes made.
Yeah.
Does she have the contract currently? Because for a couple of years, she didn't have the contract.
Sounds like they
She
do.
implied that she did, so it sounded like she.
Well, we can, with or without a bill, we can have more conversation, we can take more testimony if it's an area of interest to committee. And we don't have to decide that right now, but just. All right. If there isn't anything else, then thanks, everybody.
Field trip for field trip? Field trip?
Yeah,
Yeah, need a.
okay, we'll be sending out directions.
Right.
Great afternoon.
Where are you guys going for the harvest?
We're going, we're down the road.
Wanna go?
Go. Bring your crampons.
Yeah.
Agree, enjoy your friends.
Your beach shoes.